Welcome to EconRoots, your podcast on the roots of economic thought. I'm Stefan.
And I'm Otto.
Let's get on with today's conversation. Good day, dear listener. Thank you once again for listening into our journey through the Nobel laureates. I am, as always, one of your hosts, Stefan, and join me today is your other host,
Otto.
Thank you so much for listening to us. Today we have a really joyous episode because this is some of the issues I care really much about. Taught a lot of stuff within this stuff, and it is the rationality of rational choice. I love this. I'm a big believer in rational choice. So our stars of today's are Becker, Simon, and Mirless, and we sort of already talked a little bit about Mirless last time. So we'll do his bio in this one, but we'll start with the other ones because we like to do it in the order that they got the prize. So should I just briefly do a bio on Herbert Simon, and then
Yes.
we'll start to talk about some of his enormously many contributions, right? But the ones that are most relevant for this. So Herbert Alexander Simon, born June 15, 1916, died February 9, 2001, was, as most people on this show, American. He was a political scientist. He was also a computer scientist. He was an economist, and he was a cognitive psychologist, or at least worked in these fields. He received the Nobel Prize in 78, and actually also the Turing Award. He received that early in 75, so I think he's the only one who got both those. Turing Award is given for computer science. So he got the prize for his pioneering research into decision-making process within economic organizations. He was very much of an interdisciplinarian, and we'll only briefly touch on some of his stuff. He's also, some of the readings of him is a bit controversial, but we'll talk about that in a moment. He was at Carnegie Mellon University most of his career, where he also helped build the computer science department, actually. But before that, he was, of course, born. He was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His dad was Jewish, and he's an engineer, and his mom a pianist. So he got this idea that, life was something that you could investigate scientifically, and that you could create solutions to things. He got that from his parents. They engaged him really early on in actually thinking about these sort of questions of social change from a scientific point of view. He was an avid atheist. He played the piano himself as well. He was also a mountain climber. He had wide interest. He taught an undergraduate class in the French Revolution. It's very impressive. He was really also a polymath, sort of like Arrow, which we had in the last episode. He started studying economics under John R. Commons, who became one of his earliest influences. But he was also actually influenced by his younger brother, Harold Merkel, who studied economics as well, who was a big influence on him. And he was married for 63 years. Before unfortunately passing away. So there's lots of stuff to uncover with Simon, and let's just jump right into it here. So why did he get the prize, Otto?
His main contribution was
to economics, because he started,
yes, to economics, and then it was the prize in economics he won.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll talk about that.
That was the discussion of rationality.
Yeah,
of course, rationality is. The concept of rationality is extremely important.
Yeah.
In economic theory, because we assume that agents have some kind of rationality.
Yeah.
But the kind of rationality they have determines how they're going to act. Maybe we should start out with the kind of rationality that was criticized by Simon, and sort of the standard assumption of rationality in economics. The standard assumption is the concept called instrumental rationality, and it rests on the idea that all individuals they can pre-order all alternative states of the world. In the sense that they can order them in the order they would prefer them. So if you would prefer $20 to $10, that would be part of your ordering. Of course, the assumption is that you have a total pre-order on every state that is relevant to the choice problem you're facing. So I don't know. Have you considered? Would you prefer if you couldn't buy and sell them? Would you prefer 1,000 Ferraris to 500 Lamborghinis?
Without the ability to trade, you're saying, right? Yeah. So I don't know.
No, you don't know.
Exactly.
So it's probably not a problem that's going to turn up.
Okay.
But basically, and this is sort of being a little bit ironic about it.
Yeah.
But basically, we assume that agents are able to pre-order all states of the world, and that they will always choose the highest ordered state. That's sort of that's instrumental rationality. But so rationality would span all alternatives available to you. If you're just looking at a simple market, it could be much simpler than adding all details of the world, because a lot of details of the world would be the same in all states. But basically, that's how we economists understand rationality usually. And that's how people act in our models. Last episode was about general equilibrium theory, and we assumed that all agents are rational.
In that sense, instrumentally rational.
Yes. So that's how all markets would come together. Would be by that understanding of rationality. That requires an enormous amount of information we don't have, and considerations that would take time. I mean, if you should, you might be able to solve the problem I gave you before about the cars, which we would prefer.
What a wonderful use of my time.
But that would take up time that you could spend more productively on something else. So Simon's idea was that that's not how we really choose. We are not instrumentally rational. We are
boundedly rational. Exactly.
Bounded. So you would basically, because it is a high cost of being instrumentally rational. You could even argue that it was irrational to be rational.
Let's not open that Pandora's box.
Say that we would probably use a much more limited focus. We would basically focus at the problem at hand. And bounded rationality, his basic idea was what is also become to be known as satisficing, in the sense that instead of calculating all our actions, we use rules of thumb. And as long as what happens when we use these rules of thumbs is in line with our expectations, we don't really revise those. So you probably go to the same store every week to buy stuff, and if they have the number of goods and at the prices that you are used to, you'll probably go next week as well. You wouldn't investigate the entire market every time. But if you came to the store one day and there was they didn't have the goods they used to have, or they were much more expensive than they used to be, you would be surprised.
And then I might cause me to change behavior.
Then you would change your behavior.
So a lot to uncover here. So basically, bounded rationality is accepting that people act somewhat rationally, but they are limited in their cognitive ability, their processing ability, or they might even have biases, as you're saying. And those biases, so Herbert Simon, inspired a lot of other economists, including the whole. That's why I stopped you before the Pandora's box and the whole behavioral economics, which we're going to have an episode on. Whether our bias is rational or they're not rational exactly, but also, for instance, our fellow Dane Foss and Weber has written a great paper about Williamson's transaction cost opportunism, where it says that might actually also just be bounded rationality. It might not necessarily be opportunism with guile, but it might just be this. So there's huge applications of this idea, and I think, and also the idea that saying, if we go to public choice, for instance, because some of the first people to take Simon's point serious was actually Buchanan and Tullock. I think they, in the calculus of consent, are taking some of these points very valid. Hayek as well. Hayek definitely believed in bounded rationality. Yes. So in public choice, it's interesting because if you accept the fact that people might not be maximizing, but only satisfying, that can actually also explain some policy failures. Because it might, let's say we're in a country with lots of corruption, it might actually over the long term be maximizing your lifetime income to not be corrupt as a civil servant or politician or whatever. Like if you had that span, you would say, okay, right, and that's not even think about the common good. That would just be you saying, it's actually better in the long term to live in a society with no corruption. But right now, I just won $1,000. So so I'm satisfied with that for now, right? So this has huge implications for so many ways of how we view the world. And just to finish that off before we move on, it's nowadays when economists are asked to define rationality, I think we sort of gone full circle, because I think most will actually use a version of what Mises is using. They might not know that it's him, but saying that rationality is just trying to exchange what you think is a better state for what you think is a worse state. And that think is important. That's the bounded part. You don't really know, right? You might decide to cut your hair and be bald, right? And you think that will make you really attractive, Otto, but and then you realize that was a mistake, right? So
hopefully it'll grow out again.
I'm also, dear listener, making this joke on Otto's behalf because I found a picture of Herbert Simon that sort of looks like Otto. So that was only one. So anyway,
is it from behind?
No, not even. So another thing we need to talk about with him, because I think we covered a lot of it here before we move on to Becker, is the idea of administrative man and administrative behavior. So again, something that influences a lot of later economists are saying that behavior changes when you're within an organization. That's an extremely important point. And it's also here where he gets controversial within economics. Because is this a positive or normative analysis? Does he actually want people, as some say, to behave more like computers? Is that actually an ideal human administrative man, or is he just using it as a metaphor? And this is some of the more controversial stuff in how you read Herbert Simon these days. Yeah, but the administrative behavior part is important, right?
Yeah. And you, of course, could link that to his idea of rationality.
Oh, definitely.
Because
they're linked.
If it is rule guided, then basically you could say that the rules make up the institution, or the institution is the rules.
Yeah.
And if you can influence those, you might influence how different institutions work, because people optimize or satisfies in a different direction. Of course, the important question here is what's going to happen in the long run.
Yeah.
So if I keep on revising my rules of thumbs, finally, how long should I keep on revising them?
Oh yeah.
Well, I would in the end I wouldn't keep on revising them if I reached the result I would get by instrumental rationality. So that would then I wouldn't be able to improve my behavior seen from my own perspective. So you could also see the instrumental rationality as a projection of where bounded rationality in the end is going to lead.
Yeah.
So it might be, of course, if you look at it literally, it would be quite easy to test if people are instrumentally rational. I could just like I asked you one question before. I could ask you to write out the entire pre-order of every imaginable state of the world, which you were going to prefer, and I guess my guess is
I would prefer not doing that.
I couldn't find a single individual who would be able to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
So taking very literally, nobody are instrumentally rational. Computers might be if they have a function they maximize, but
AI.
But if we are revising our rules of thumbs fairly effectively, we would end the same place.
Yeah.
So, and basically, I think this is really, I think it's an intriguing point is that the reason why we assume instrumental rationality in economic models is that it's much easier to handle in the model, whereas in the real world choice situations, rules of thumbs are easier to handle.
Yeah.
So we choose the assumption or the way of thinking that's easiest to handle, and so that's of course very important when talking about rationality. It's not like that economists who use instrumental rationality, full rationality, that they really assume that that's the way people act, but they're assuming that it's a good enough assumption to really describe the way they behave.
So just before we move on to Becker, one thing I'd like to just add to this, because I do think there's so many philosophical and methodological questions unraveling in this, and it's not like economics is falling together. The pieces when you engage in this, they actually become stronger by actually engaging with these questions. So if North, the Nobel laureate Douglas North, is famous for saying that economists should take this passing of time seriously, thereby also technology, you might argue that Simon's point is that we should take humans seriously. Hayek make a similar point. He says we should take the free will seriously, right? But he's actually a little bit different here. He's saying that, we should take the follies of humanity more seriously. And that is interesting, and I think it's relevant to do. But the question that remains is, how then actually to explain long-term social change, right? Because there are entrepreneurs who break the pattern. There are societies that do better because they have classical liberal institutions, good democracies, whatever, and they are sort of formed by people who somehow decides to act differently than what you should think would be short-term satisfying for them, right? Not satisfying, but satisfying for them. So I think there's a lot of stuff here that is both really interesting as a challenge to economic methodology, but also raises some questions that are a little bit hard-edged. So our listeners can ponder about those. But let's move on to Gary Becker, also a huge star. So just try to keep the bio short, but it's going to be hard. So Gary Stanley Becker was born December 2, 1903, and died May 3rd, 2014. He was an American as well, received the Nobel Prize in 1992 for, and I quote, having extended the domain of microeconomic analysis to a wide range of human behavior and interaction, including non-market behavior. Non-market behavior is such a funny term, by the way, but that is... Milton Friedman actually described him as, and I quote again, the greatest social scientist who has lived and worked in the second part of the 20th century. That's big words from a person like Friedman. And he was sort of the founder, leader, whatever you want to call it, of the third Chicago School, which, as you mentioned in an earlier episode, focuses on the behavior of agents, using the ideas of the Chicago School, taking them down on the level of agents. He was a professor of economics and sociology at the University of Chicago. He also got the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and he is in a 2011 survey of economic professors, among economic professors, they named him as their favorite living economist over the age of 60, followed by Arrow and Solow, so two other stars, right? He was born to a Jewish family in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. He got his first degree at Princeton, and then moved on to Chicago, where his very famous thesis was called "The Economics of Discrimination." He was definitely influenced by Friedman, but again took it in another direction. Becker said Friedman was the greatest teacher he had ever had, so definitely important. He was a young prodigy. He was very early recognized as being a smart fellow. He was also, besides a famous professor and recipient of the John Bates Clark Medal in 1967, he was also a founding member of the TGG Group. He was a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, member of the National Academy of Sciences, and a member of the Philosophical Society, and of course a member and president of Montpellier Society, a classical liberal all the way. Although he also considered himself a conservative in his personal life, which is many classical liberals of course can, and he wrote for Business Week on social issues for a long time. He was married twice. His first wife died, unfortunately, but he did get two daughters, his lecture. I wanna highlight that a moment here, and then read one quote from his banquet speech. So his lecture is a great lecture which really is a great overview of his thoughts. So if you're interested in what we'll discuss in a moment, please pick that up. You can find it on the webpage. He has a great statement in that, which we'll also use as a teacher. He says, "Thus, ones remain unsatisfied in rich countries as well as in poor ones." I love that quote. Anyway, a small quote from the banquet speech, and then we'll talk about rational choice, is that, and I quote, "Economics surely does not provide a romantic vision of life, but the widespread poverty, misery, and crisis in many parts of the world, much of it unnecessary, are strong reminders that understanding economic and social laws can make an enormous contribution to the welfare of people." I love that quote. It is humble and great at the same time. It's a great quote. It's a great reminder of why we're interested in what an old racist once called the dismal science. So Becker, so much to uncover here. Why did he get the prize, Otto?
Lots of reasons.
Lots of reasons.
Yeah. But one thing he did was that he used what was considered economic tools, basically price theory.
Yeah.
Which we talk about in the last episode. He used it on in areas where it hasn't been used before. It was thought of as economic theory was about economics,
yes,
which is about markets, how markets work.
Yeah.
But Becker really asked, can't the economic tools, if people are the same and they use the same tools, whatever problems they face, they must use their tools. Can we explain phenomena which is outside the usual realms of economics? So he looked at, for instance, at the way the family works.
Yeah. Discrimination, crime.
Basically, we have seen, for just take one example, that's that fertility has gone down all over the world as people get richer and at mortality among children is going down. The number of children people get is going down.
Yeah.
And basically, Becker has explained this, saying that we have, as you get richer, children become more of a consumption good than an investment good. If you're poor and very few options are available for you to save up for your old age, that one way of doing that was to get children who could care for you in your old age. So that was sort of the investment. But you also get enjoyment from children, and
presumably,
a lot of frustrated. In spite of all, we still have the urge to get children, because we get some kind of enjoyment out of it. and that could be explained in economic terms. And the way we invest in our children, because we also sort of have sympathy for our children and want them to have a good life.
Yeah.
So we could leave them a heritage. You could earn a lot of money and leave it to your children, but you could also invest in their human capital, as you call it, in education. So seeing education as a capital good on line with a machine or whatever you have, capital good was an idea he made. You mentioned that you could look at the economics of discrimination.
Yeah. Well, so
and you could look at crime, addiction.
Yeah.
The economic theory of rational addiction. And basically what he did was he said, let's look at all social phenomena. Let's start out with the economic method and see how far it can take us. And what did he understand as the economic method? It was that people are maximizing their behavior, rational, that markets tend to clear, to get in equilibrium. And thirdly, which is of course important in a lot of contexts, that preferences are stable over time. So, of course, if you change, even if you are very rational, if you change your preferences all the time, that could be difficult problem to handle. Or, but the assumption that they're fairly stable, or the sort of basic preferences are fairly stable over time, that's also an assumption he made. So, using these basically three assumptions, he went ahead trying to look at a lot of phenomena and was very successful doing that. And I think it's one you have to realize that he was really extremely respectful. And this was a new way of looking at people in social science or even in other sciences. We tend to look at people as the expert and looking at the mistakes they're making.
Yeah.
But Becker really said, let's assume that they are really doing the best they can.
Yeah, within the framework that they have.
Yeah,
right?
yes.
Well, constraint, yeah. So I like to touch a little bit. I think you said a lot of interesting things, so I'd like to comment a little bit on this. So I actually do think he was a very nice guy. Some people misread him and don't realize what he did. But just to give an example of how he really shows that economics, at least to a degree, is a humanist science, is, for instance, his treatment of criminality. So before Becker decided to use basic economic insights to explain crime, people thought criminals were either victims of a poor upbringing, poverty, or whatever, so they victimized them, so taking away their humanity in that way, or that was typically on the left. On the right, you thought that criminals had some kind of mental deficiency, right? Now, both those things can still be true in individual cases, but what Becker showed was using expected utility and rational choice theory, which I'll explain in a moment. So I think most of our listeners knows what it is, but just I'll do explain it in a moment. You can see that if you live in a neighborhood where there's a large chance to get shot when you go outside your door, it's actually might be smart for you to commit a petty crime and go to jail, because you're not going to get shot in jail, right? So it actually, and this sounds like a horrible conclusion, but it's actually taking the humanity and dignity of the people who commit crimes seriously and saying it's not because they're crazy, it's not because they're victims, they're actually humans like you and me, right? So just briefly for those listeners who don't know, so expected utility, which is a core building block of price theory and particularly rational choice, is the idea that I constantly make an assessment in my mind, not necessarily consciously, but somewhere we're saying, what is my key benefit that I stand to gain? What is the likely cost? What is the cost? And then I multiply that with the likelihood of the two things, right? So if there's if the chance that by crossing the street I'll get run over and die, that seems like I should never cross the street. But the chance of me getting run over and die if I cross the street with a green man is really, really low. So, and my benefit from crossing the street and getting to work is actually fairly high. Not compared to dying, but when you multiply it with the likelihood, it's actually, much likely to happen. So this is the idea that he does. And I like a lot of what you said. For instance, the education part is so interesting because, again, here people say, oh, that's an instrumental view of education and so on. Yeah, it might be, but it's also looking at education for what it is. Education takes resources. You spend time there, you have opportunity costs, and then preferably it causes you to become more productive. So that is exactly how we would define a capital good normally. I reshape these rocks into a house. I can live there, and because I live there, I don't get a cold, so I can work more the next day. Right? It's the same approach, but to some people, it's provocative. It shouldn't be really. Like he's just pointing it out. Like the word for school in both Greek and Latin actually means leisure time. Right? So if you don't have leisure time, you don't have the opportunity to get education, which is one of the problems for many poor countries, or historically in the West, that Harvard wasn't that expensive in the 19th century, but very few people could spare the time to go there, right? And nowadays, most people get at least a fairly high degree of education, at least in Western countries. Then you can challenge and say, but is that then productive education? But that's a whole other debate. I know you comment a little bit on that. One last thing I think I like to add, and then you can come back in, is that because he was so provocative, he's also like an unwielding founder of lots of like side disciplines. So we have a bonus episode with Professor Becker, who wrote an amazing book on the history of feminist and gender economics, and she goes over that, and she basically says that Becker started the idea of feminist economics, not necessarily by choice, but he treats the he treats the family by saying, okay, the family's utility function is the same utility function as the main breadwinner, which might be sort of true in the 50s, right? But it's extremely provocative today. So a lot of feminists and gender economics thought that is too simple, and they try to attack it. Now many uses the same basic idea he has. They just expanded the framework, right? So it's still a rational choice framework. It's just, realize there might be two breadwinners and these kind of things. There might be other things that influence. So definitely one of the most important economists. I agree with Friedman. You think, what else should we add? Anything we forgotten, or something you want to comment on?
Somebody might wonder if I didn't leave out a fourth assumption. Yeah. Talking about the assumption that Becker used, equilibrium, stable preferences, maximizing behavior, but what about self-interest?
Oh, yeah.
And to many, I say, perhaps especially non-economists, the concept of rationality is linked to the idea of self-interest. But really it isn't.
No.
It really isn't. So rationality is one thing. It's how to maximize given preferences.
Yeah.
But these preferences don't have to be self-interested. Of course, in a lot of settings, it makes sense to assume that people are self-interested. For instance, in a market where you have competition, it makes sense to assume that businesses are maximizing their profits. Because if businesses don't do that, they would tend to be driven out by businesses that do. So and you could see the same mechanism in a lot of places, but there's no inherent reason why the interests of others than the individual himself, if we're talking about the 50th breadwinner, should not include, should only include the self-interest, narrow self-interest of that individual.
Yeah.
And of course, if you look at things like the family, Becker is not. He broadens the perspective from narrow self-interests.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So so we take the interests of others into account, and especially those close to us. This actually if you trace the idea back, it goes back to Adam Smith as well, who has the idea about sympathy, which is strongest when to people who are closest to us.
The two worlds we inhabit.
Love, even if you're very, very, very close. So, and Becker had this. He was very aware that you shouldn't necessarily, when you study non-market phenomena, you shouldn't necessarily assume that people are narrowly self-interested, because we are self-interested in the sense that if we care about others, that's part of our preferences.
Yeah, definitely.
And so we're trying to maximize those, but they're not selfish in a narrow sense.
And that's exactly it. So you can look at if you do a utility for the family, part of that utility is, of course, the rest of the members have a good welfare, and you have all these things. And I do think this is a very important and often misunderstood point. Hayek talks about it as well in Individualism, True and False, where he says self-interest, probably understood, is the interest of everything I care about. I think the quote goes something along that, right? And you can also see it today in taxation. So, one debate we have in Denmark, I know our American listeners just love all our Danish examples, but whatever, we'll still use them, is substitution effect on taxes, whether you should lower taxes on the first money you earn or the last money you earn. So in a progressive tax system like in Denmark, we have different tax brackets depending on how much income you have. And even though it sounds really nice to lower it at the lower brackets, that might actually have the substitution effect that then people will work less because they quickly make more money to spend time with their family. So if we assume they actually like their family, they might actually work less if they quickly make that money, right? So I think there's a lot of really important insights in understanding social phenomenon the way that Becker does, that goes way beyond just, that little unit of analysis. You can take it to the macro level very easily. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that how he has really won the field. He was, when he first proposed these ideas in the 60s, sociologists, all other social sciences were horrified by the idea that you could use the economic insight and that you could use such a crude idea of man to explain the phenomenon among people who are very complicated and richly described. But really it comes back to what we're talking about. Becker had an enormous respect for people in the sense that he assumed that they were doing the best they could.
Yeah, exactly.
And given their preferences and other constraints, that actually what they did made sense.
Yeah, exactly. He believed in universal dignity. In that way, he was very much a classical liberal. I totally agree. And just a very short point on that before just briefly talk on Mirless, and then we'll finish up today. Mirless, is that so when new things happen in economics that are sort of a little bit outside what the mainstream is interested in, there sort of seems to be two strategies, right? So there's a strategy of Becker to just keep fighting on until everybody listens. The same thing Werner Smith did with experimental economics, keep submitting papers. Experimental economics was also viewed with a lot of scorn in the beginning, right? And now it's a key feature of our toolbox. Or you can do like what the public choice people did and sort of found their own school of research, their own journals and so on, right? And oftentimes sort of both things happen. There's obviously like journals of experimental economics today and all that kind of stuff, but it's just, it's interesting, both paths are hard, I think, but Becker definitely aced the one where he got everybody to understand what he's trying to say. So he's also a great role model in that sense. So let's just finish up with Mirless. We already talked about him in the previous episode, so please check that out. And I'll just briefly do his bio, and then we can talk a little bit about what he adds to the discussion of rationality. So Sir James Alexander Mirless, he was born on July 5th, 1936, died August 29, 2018. He's British, not American. He's a 1996 winner of the prize. He was knighted in 1997, and he got the prize for their fundamental contribution to the economic theory of incentives under asymmetric information. So it's sort of a crossover between what we talked about last time with equilibrium and today. He was born in Minigraf, Kirkcudbrightshire, I think it's pronounced, in Scotland. Yeah. You want to give it a go? I have it here. Okay.
I take your word for it.
Yeah, exactly. And educated at the Scottish system all the way up to the Master of Arts in Mathematics and Natural Philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. And the Scottish educational system is a bit different from the English in that they have more general exams and so on. But he did ultimately go on to Trinity College in Cambridge, where he got a PhD. He was also a fellow student with Amartya Sen, who also got the period later on. He's been a visiting professor 3 times at MIT. He's been at University of Berkeley and Yale, and he taught at Oxford as well as Cambridge, so both of them. It was at the time during Oxford that he published what would win him the prize. He also served on Scotland's Council of Economic Affairs, and he did the WWII, which I think you alluded to last time, the Mirless review, right, with the one with the UK tax system and so on. And he was, as far as I know, not Jewish, but he was a firm atheist. Why do you think he has something interesting to say in terms of rationality? I have a guess, but you want to start?
Well, of course, he basically assumes rationality, like most economists. As you mentioned, his focus was on the implications of information,
exactly.
Limited information,
on incentives.
Yeah, and this really has become a very, very important topic, and we're going to return to the subject many times because a lot of theory has to do with problems arising when you're trying to incentivize somebody you don't have perfect information about.
Yeah.
So, and I think we touched upon this the last time that he made a contribution to tax theory and optimal taxation. If you wanted the details of the results, you could go back to that episode. But basically, he sees the problem of taxation as one of limited information by the tax authorities, assuming that we have different abilities to pay taxes. One way of discovering that was just ask people, what is your ability to pay taxes? And you, Stefan, might say, well, I have a very high ability.
Not desire, though, only ability.
But if you were totally truthful, you would say that, well, if I worked all the time, I could pay this much in taxes. And then giving this information, the tax authorities could not just write out a tax bill to everybody, depending on their ability, and that wouldn't affect their behavior in any way. So that would be a perfect tax system where you could redistribute as much as you liked, and Mirless liked to redistribute. And you would have no efficiency cost.
Yeah.
The problem is, of course, that the information that you have as an agent is your private information, and you're not willing necessarily to reveal that.
Yeah.
In some cases, you are interested to reveal your private information. Saying you're in a market, and you have a price you're willing to pay for a good. If you go to a marketplace, it makes no sense for you to hide your willingness to pay if there's just one price.
Yeah.
So you couldn't make your situation better by hiding your willingness to pay for a good. But if we're talking about taxation, that is, as you indicated, much different. So if they've just asked me, I would say I have very low ability.
Sorry.
So
I like to do it better.
So yes,
it is what it is.
And so it would make much sense just asking me what the authorities then could do is that they could look at my income, but that is related to my ability. But it's also related to other things like hard work. So I might have a low ability to pay taxes because I'm not very smart, but I might be willing to work hard, and we wouldn't want to discourage that. So you get a signal from the income, but it's not a perfect signal about the ability. And in that situation, you should try to incentivize the agents, for instance, the taxpayer, to give as precise as information as possible, while still trying to achieve the other goals you have. Of course, one way to make taxpayers tell the truth was to say that if you report your ability, we're not going to tax you. But that would compromise the idea the authority has of getting tax revenue. So they have to compromise, and one compromise could be to sort of to limit the wealth they are going to take away from people. So even if you want, as Mirless did, want to redistribute all the gains from differences in ability, you shouldn't do that, because that would create an incentive to hide your ability too much. So you should balance these things, and in a lot of situations you have this sort of, it's often referred to as the principal-agent problem, that the principal who really making the decision doesn't have as a precise information as the agent. And how do you create incentives that maximize the incentives given the goals you have, for instance?
So I think two last points before we finish off, which is one of them is very much related to what you're saying here, is that oftentimes when we talk about PA problem, principal agent problem, we do talk about moral hazard and adverse selection and these kind of things. But we always sort of assume, well, it's part of the theory to assume that it's driven by opportunism and self-interest on the side of the agent or the principal. And one thing that Mirless shows is that it might not be. It might even happen, right? It might, I might have no desire to actually cheat you, but because I don't have full information, or my information comes about in not optimal frequencies or whatever, I might end up, or we might end up in a moral hazard situation that none of us really wanted. I didn't set out to cheat you as a principal. It wasn't my desire, but it happened anyway, right? Yeah. Because of lack of information in the initial phase where we did the institutional or the contract design. And I think that's a really important point, saying, it's not just opportunism. Sometimes it's, the actual structure of life and so on. And that leads to the last point, is that he sort of says, many models would probably work a lot better if we just assume full information, but then they also lose the predictive power. We're going back to what we talked about last time. And therefore, we do have to put in agents in informational constraint, even though it's quite messy and it messes up the model. But it ultimately gives a better result, and we just have to work harder to get to that. And I think that's an important point. And I think it also goes back to, basically a little bit back to Herbert Simon and about rationality as well, right? So I think this has been a great episode about rationality and information and so on.
And we're coming back to it many times.
Many times, all of this. But so this is a great basic this. So with this, I like to say thank you to you, Otto, for our second season. We're rounding that off now. It doesn't matter so much, but it's just for some reason we do 12 episodes each season. So thank you so much. Regular episodes. And thank you, dear listeners, for being with us on this journey. I hope you get something out of it. Please remember to share your ideas and thoughts and so on, comments. And until next time, and I say this with a lot of gravity today, stay rational. Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with us exploring the history of economic thought. You're very welcome to email comments and suggestions to stefan@cepas.dk. Please like and share and recommend this podcast anywhere you can and think it's relevant. Until next time, stay rational.